The millionaire sneered at the waitress during the party. "Serve me in 10 different languages." 3 seconds later, his smile vanished. No one suspected that behind that worn apron was a past that could shake his entire empire. What if a single sentence could make someone who once scorned you bow their head? Leave a comment below, because your story might be the one that leaves someone else speechless. Elena stepped out of the locker room, smoothing down her crisp white apron. The uniform was a bit old, but she kept it pressed and spotless every day, as if tending to that one small thing could prove that her life hadn't completely fallen apart. She adjusted her bun, checking her reflection in the small mirror mounted in the hallway. The face looking back at her bore the marks of time, but her eyes were still bright, steady, with a touch of quiet, resigned sadness. Before heading out to the dining room, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, a gentle reminder, "Stay calm. Elena, just do your job." From the street outside, the distant, mournful sound of a lone jazz saxophone drifted in, mingling with the scent of fine wine and old oak. The Veritas Room glowed in the heart of a historic Manhattan neighborhood, a place where the wealthy came to feel more sophisticated, more cultured than everyone else. Elena had worked here for 2 years. 2 years was long enough to learn how to smile when ordered around, how to step back when people looked right through her. She no longer had any extravagant dreams. She just wanted peace, to do her job well, and to not cause trouble for anyone. Tonight was a big private event. The manager, Maria, a woman well into her years, spoke to her in a low voice. "Table 7, VIPs, watch every word. Morales." She nodded, cradling a tray of wine glasses as she entered the private dining room. The space was so luxurious that even breathing seemed to be a measured act. Candlelight flickered against the old brick walls. The clinking of glasses, the calculated bursts of laughter, it all belonged to the orderly world of the upper crust. At the head of the table, Arthur Pierce, the 50-year-old chairman of Pierce Holdings, was speaking with the confident tone of a man accustomed to being heard. This exquisite Napa Valley Cabernet, a masterpiece from California, everyone around him nodded and smiled politely. Elena leaned down slightly, her eyes glancing at the bottle's label, a Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir, 2010 vintage. She recognized it instantly, unmistakable. She had once translated the ad copy for that very winery in her old life, before her world had shattered under the weight of a wrongful lawsuit. She said nothing, continuing to pour the wine. But when a younger guest beside Arthur asked, half joking, "I thought this was a Pinot," she paused, just for a second. Then she looked up and said softly, "Pardon me, Sire. It is indeed a wonderful Pinot Noir. Napa is also in California, but they are two very different regions." A small, simple statement, but in that room, it rang out like the clash of steel. The air froze. The scraping of forks stopped. The laughter died. The room fell so silent you could hear the soft hiss of the candle wicks. Elena didn't know why she'd said it. Perhaps it was because she saw the chef standing in the corner, his face pale. If the guest discovered the wine was misidentified, the blame would fall on him. She only wanted to spare someone else a reprimand. That was all. She wasn't trying to prove she knew more than anyone. But sometimes, the truth is what people least want to hear. At the head of the table, has no mouse and dog, Arthur Pierce set his glass down, slowly rotating his wrist. He looked at her, the candlelight reflected in his deep-set eyes, making his gaze cold and unreadable. A flicker of anger, small, but definite. He pressed his lips together, trying to keep his voice level. "Well, thank you for the lesson. A most unexpected education." A short, forced laugh rippled around the table. Elena bowed her head and continued her work. But beneath her apron, her hands were clenched into fists, not from fear, but from sorrow. She knew she had just crossed a line, but between truth and silence, she had chosen the truth. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a faint, condescending smile still on his lips. Inside him, an irritating flame was rising. Since when did he let some anonymous waitress make him lose face? He was about to say something to regain control, a sarcastic remark, a familiar, cruel joke. But when he met her calm gaze, the words caught in his throat. She wasn't subservient. She wasn't apologetic. But she wasn't defiant either. There was only the quiet certainty of someone who knew she was not wrong. When Elena returned to the table again, Arthur was ready with his comeback. He smiled faintly, his voice loud enough for the whole table to hear. "If you're so confident, then toast our table in 10 different languages." A few people exchanged glances. No one laughed. Elena set the bottle down and lifted her head to look at him. Her dark brown eyes held a light that was both firm and gentle. With all due respect, "Sire," and then she began. In Italian, "À la salute," warm and melodic. In French, "À votre santé," as soft as velvet. In German, "Prost," crisp and strong. Then came Japanese, Portuguese, Russian, Arabic, Mandarin, and English. Each language a different color, each sound a different heartbeat. The room held its breath. No one dared to move. Finally, she spoke in her native Spanish, her voice low and deep, ringing out like a prayer. "Y que la sabiduría nos encuentre a todos, algún día, and may wisdom find us all." Someday. A long silence followed. There was no more laughter, not another word spoken. Only the candles still flickered, their light reflecting on faces that were a mixture of confusion and shame. A few people clapped softly. One man bowed his head. Arthur Pierce sat motionless, the wine in his glass tilted, shimmering. A muscle in his jaw twitched. His familiar pride had been challenged, and his self-respect was being stirred by something deeper. As Elena bowed and quietly left, he followed her with his eyes. The candlelight played on her back. On the simple black fabric of her uniform, her hair swayed gently with each step, until she turned to close the door behind her. The soft click of the latch was barely audible, but in his soul, it sounded like a resounding slam, closing a moment that, for reasons he couldn't understand, made him feel small. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on the closed door. In his glass, the wine was still red, but the taste had gone flat. When the party ended, he was the last to leave. Outside, Manhattan was late, a river of light flowing over cobblestone streets, reflecting a somber gold. In the corner of the room, the manager, Maria, was clearing up, her eyes still glancing toward Elena. That woman was folding napkins, her movements slow and gentle, as if afraid of breaking the silence. Arthur walked to the door, his shadow stretched across the floor. Reaching the spot where she stood, he walked past her without a word, but his gaze lingered quickly. Silently, that night, in his penthouse on the 30th floor, he opened his phone. Online, one of the guests had already posted a video. The waitress who speaks 10 languages. He pressed play. Her face appeared on the screen, her calm eyes, her low, warm voice. No arrogance, no anger, only the confidence of someone who knew her own worth. He watched it a second time, then a third. Her eyes were still there, seeming to look through the screen, through every mask he had ever worn. He felt exposed, small, a foreign feeling for a man accustomed to standing at the pinnacle of power. He put his phone down and poured another glass of wine. But when he took a sip, the familiar taste was suddenly bitter. The city lights reflected off the polished table, cold and silent. "Who is she?" he whispered. Alone in the room, filled with the scent of wine, where for the first time, Arthur Pierce felt he no longer had the upper hand. The next morning began like any other. The alarm clock blared at 5:30. Monotonous and cold. Elena sat up, gently rubbing her temples. her eyes puffy from a nearly sleepless night. She toasted a dry slice of bread and poured a glass of coffee left over from the night before. Everything in her small studio apartment was quiet, so quiet she could hear the tired ticking of the clock on the wall. Outside, New York was waking up. She put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and stepped out onto the street. Blending into the crowded crush of the early morning bus, everyone carried a silent burden. And Elena was no different. Last night, she was the woman who had silenced a room of elites. This morning, she was just a waitress trying to get to work on time. When she entered the restaurant through the staff entrance, the atmosphere was different. No one said anything, but the silence was as thick as smoke. Quick glances, hushed whispers that died as she walked past. She didn't need to ask to know what had happened. The video must have been passed around. Elena said nothing, just walked straight to the locker room and changed into her clean uniform, her only armor. Work was her sanctuary. In this chaotic world, at least the act of wiping a table or stacking a set of plates had clear rules. Do it right, and it will be clean. She was drying wine glasses, one by one, when she heard Maria's voice behind her. "Elena, could you come to my office for a moment?" Her voice held a sadness that Elena knew all too well. Maria's office was small and cluttered. But cosy. On her desk was an old lamp, stacks of invoices, and a few black and white photos on the wall. The smell of stale coffee and old paper gave the space a strange tranquility. Maria sat down with a sigh. She had been in this business for nearly 40 years. The lines on her forehead were like little roads leading to countless stories of fired employees, of tears hidden behind the bar. "My phone was ringing before the sun came up," Maria said softly. "The owner called. He saw the video. He said, you embarrassed an important client, that you damaged the reputation of the Veritas room." Elena stood perfectly still. Her hands were clasped together, ice cold. "I only told the truth." Maria looked at her, her eyes a mix of sympathy and exhaustion. "The truth, my dear? In this world, the truth is a luxury. I know it, and you know it, but the truth doesn't pay the rent. It doesn't buy medicine for your mother." Those words made Elena's throat tighten. For a moment, an image of her mother flashed in her mind, her silver hair spread across an old pillow, her frail hands gripping Elena's one last time before she left her small town for the city. "You have to keep your job. Elena, whatever happens, don't let them say you gave up." Maria opened a desk drawer and took out a piece of paper. "The owner wants you to sign this. A formal warning. He said if there's one more complaint, no matter how small, I'll have to let you go." Elena looked at the paper. The cold, printed words looked like iron bars. She thought of her mother lying in a small room back home, waiting for the money she sent every month. She thought of unpaid bills, of the promise that everything is fine that she repeated in her short letters. A part of her wanted to fight back, to say that justice couldn't be bought. But the other part, the part that had learned to survive after years of being slandered and forgotten, was just exhausted. She took a deep breath. "Keep the job. For Mom." She picked up the pen. The nib touching the paper made a dry, cracking sound. She signed, not out of fear, but out of love. When she looked up, her voice was calm. "I understand. Maria, I won't cause any more trouble." Maria nodded slowly, her eyes slightly moist. "I know. Elena, I believe you." Elena managed a small smile, but inside, she felt hollow. She bowed her head and left the office. Outside, the morning light streamed through the window, clear and cold. That night, on the other side of the city, Arthur Pierce sat in his top-floor office. The city lights stretched out beneath him, glittering but soulless. He turned on his computer, trying to focus on an unfinished contract, but he couldn't. The anger inside him had long since cooled, replaced by another feeling, heavy, persistent. He picked up his phone. Normally, he would check the news or scroll through some meaningless videos before bed. But this time, his finger stopped on the one video he couldn't forget, the waitress who speaks 10 languages. He played it again. On the screen, her low, calm voice rang out every word. Every syllable held a quiet dignity. Toe's eyes, composed, clear, and so distant, they made him feel as if he himself were being seen through. He watched it again, and again. By the third time, he realized what unsettled him wasn't that she had corrected him. It was that he had never seen eyes like that before, the eyes of someone who had lost everything but had held on to her dignity. For the first time in years, Arthur Pierce couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, one question circling in his mind. Who is she? The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual. From his high floor, the city looked small, but his mind was a tangled mess. He pressed the intercom button. James, come in for a moment. His young assistant appeared, holding a tablet. Yes. Sir? Arthur leaned back in his chair, his voice slow but sharp. Find out everything you can about a woman named Elena Morales. James was taken aback for a second, but simply nodded and left. Half an hour later, he returned, a look of clear unease on his face. Sir, I found her. Her story, it's not simple. He hesitated. Then read from the screen. She was formerly Dr. Elena Morales, a linguistics specialist at Columbia University. A rising star. Arthur frowned slightly. A PhD, then what happened? 3 years ago, she was accused of plagiarism and data theft in a major research project. The lawsuit destroyed her reputation. The room fell silent. Arthur propped his elbows on the desk, staring into space. The image of the waitress's quiet, sad eyes drifted back into his memory. Who made the accusation? He asked. James took a deep breath. A man named Victor Vance, CEO of Innovatech Solutions. Arthur looked up. The name was like a cold blade. He slowly turned to look at the contract on his desk, a strategic partnership agreement. Pierce Holdings and Innovatech Solutions. Victor Vance's name was printed in bold on the cover, as if it were staring right at him. In that moment, Arthur Pierce was no longer a powerful businessman. He was just a man who had realized he was about to shake hands with the very person who might have destroyed someone's life. James hesitated, his voice dropping. Sir, there's one more detail in the case file. What is it? Arthur asked, his voice low and cold. The law firm, representing Victor Vance at the time, was the legal department of Pierce Holdings. Arthur froze. A chill ran down his spine. He looked out the glass wall, where the dawn was breaking over the Manhattan skyline. In that dim light, he saw himself a man who thought he understood the world, beginning to realize the true price of his own indifference. James's words hung in the air like a stone, dropped into a still lake. The legal department of Pierce Holdings. Arthur sat motionless, his hands flat on the desk, his fingers curled slightly, as if trying to grasp something that was slipping through his control. He was a man of logic. He lived by numbers, contracts, and reason. To him, emotions were just inconvenient variables, usually to be set aside. But now, another feeling was seeping in between the neat rows of logic. Unease. The files, he said slowly, his voice unnervingly even. I want to see the complete case file. Now. But sir, it's the middle of the night, James said cautiously. I wasn't asking about the time. I was giving an order. James bowed his head and left. The door clicked shut, leaving Arthur alone in the vast office. The city lights filtered through the glass, spilling onto the floor in fragmented patterns. The room, once a symbol of his power, suddenly felt as cold as a glass cage. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on a photograph on the wall, the inauguration day of the Pierce Holdings headquarters. In the picture, he stood among hundreds of employees, his face beaming with confidence. He had once believed that power gave him control over everything, until now, when he realized it was the very thing that had blinded him to his own mistakes. An image of Elena filled his mind, her eyes calm, clear, and dignified, as if she knew exactly where she stood, who she was. No matter how much power she faced, that bow.com. What if she was innocent? The question echoed in his head, a steady knocking on a door that hadn't been opened in a long time. James returned with a thick stack of files. Arthur said nothing, just gestured for him to leave. The door closed with a soft metallic click, and he began to read. The pages were dense with legal terminology. At first, everything seemed logical. The evidence, the technical reports, the citations showing that Elena Morales' project had indications of duplication. But the more he read, the more he noticed details that made his blood run cold. Demands for responses within 48 hours, gently threatening letters from lawyers. And most importantly, there had never been an actual trial. The case had ended with a settlement agreement in which Elena withdrew, waiving her right to contest the claims. Arthur stopped. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from shame. This wasn't justice. This was the way of the powerful using procedures, time, and money to crush the will of the weaker party. And he had been a part of it. Outside, the dawn broke, the first light of day streaming through the glass. Cold and pale. On the desk, his coffee was untouched. Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes sunken from a sleepless night. He still didn't know if she was truly innocent, but he was sure of one thing. She never had a fair chance to fight, and his own company, the system he had been so proud of building, had played a part in that injustice. When James entered that morning, he found his boss standing by the window, hands in his pockets. Looking down at the stream of traffic below, the light cast his face in profile, revealing lines he didn't even know he had. "Sir, your meeting with Mr. Vance is at 10. Arthur didn't turn around. His voice was hoarse, tired. "Postpone it." James was surprised. "Postpone it? What should I tell him? Tell him I'm sick? Any illness will do. I don't care." He paused. After a long moment, his gaze still fixed on the city below, he added, "And James, find me Elena Morales' address." James looked at him. "Hesitant. What are you planning to do?" "Sir?" Arthur slowly turned, his gaze no longer as cold as before. It held something different, heavy, but real. "I need answers," he said quietly. "The kind that papers can't provide?" James nodded. But before leaving, he stopped at the doorway. "Sir, there's one more thing." Arthur stood still, not turning. "Go on." "On Ms. Morales' initial list of witnesses, my name was on it. I think I attended a preliminary project meeting when we were considering a partnership with Innovatech 3 years ago." The room was utterly silent. Arthur closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. It felt as if fragmented memories were assembling themselves into a clearer and more painful picture. He said nothing more. He just walked to his desk and picked up his car keys. In that moment, he knew what he had to do, not out of duty, but out of conscience. He wasn't looking for absolution. He was looking for the truth. Before leaving the office, he glanced at the phone sitting on his desk. The screen was lit up with a barrage of missed calls, messages, meeting reminders. He turned it off and left it there. For the first time in years, Arthur Pierce left the office without his phone, carrying only a single question in his heart. Will she ever forgive me? James's confession echoed in Arthur's mind as he drove. The words were a knife twisting deeper into his thoughts. His own assistant had been a part of the story. The mystery was no longer some old case file in the company archives. It had become a dark piece of his present, woven into the lives of the people he trusted. Arthur drove through the smaller streets of Manhattan, his heart heavy. He didn't know what he would say if he saw Elena Morales again. He only knew he needed to see her just once. Not to confront her, but to understand. He parked on a side street near the restaurant. The sign for the Veritas room shimmered in the morning sun. That name, Truth, suddenly felt bitter on his tongue. When he walked in, the daytime atmosphere made the place look different, bright, quiet, and colder. No more laughter, no more candlelight, just the clinking of a spoon against a glass. He scanned the room for the familiar neat bun and slender figure, but he didn't see her. A young waitress, Sarah, recognized him. She flinched, then approached with a forced smile. "Welcome, Sia. I'm not here to dine," Arthur said quietly. "Is Miss Elena Morales working today?" Sarah looked down, twisting her apron in her hands. "Sir, Elena, she doesn't work here anymore." His heart sank. "Doesn't work here? What do you mean?" "She was let go this morning." "Sia?" Sarah replied, her voice trembling slightly. "The owner told Maria she had to do it because of what happened the other night. Because she disturbed you." The words landed like a verdict. Arthur stood frozen. Each word struck him like a physical blow. It was him. One arrogant remark, one impulsive moment, and the woman had lost the one thing keeping her afloat. He said nothing more, just turned and walked away. His heavy footsteps echoed dryly on the stone floor. "Mr. Pierce," the voice stopped him. From the back hallway, Maria, the older manager, emerged. The light fell on her face, deepening the weary lines. There was no resentment in her eyes, only the sadness of someone who had witnessed too much injustice. "Could you join me in my office for a moment?" she asked softly. Arthur nodded. The small office was behind the kitchen, the smell of coffee mingled with dish soap. Everything old but warm. Maria gestured for him to sit, then sat across from him, her hands clasped. "I didn't want to do it," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "That girl was the best employee I've ever had, but the owner pressured me. He said reputation is more important than one waitress." She paused, her gaze drifting toward a small window. "I tried to protect her, but there are some battles that people like me can only lose." Arthur sat in silence, feeling each of her words hammer against his conscience. She didn't argue. Maria continued. She just nodded and gathered her things. Before she left, she returned her uniform, clean and pressed. Then she bowed her head and thanked me for giving her a chance. Maria pressed her lips together, fighting back tears. She thanked me, while I was the one who signed the paper that cost her her job. The air in the room was heavy. Arthur wanted to say something, but he couldn't find the words. "I'll speak to your owner," he said quietly. A belated promise. "I'll fix this." Maria shook her head, her expression softening. "Some things money can't mend. Sir, dignity is one of them." The words were gentle, but they pierced his heart. She stood up and walked to her desk. From the bottom drawer, she took out an old envelope. It was yellowed, the corners frayed. She smoothed it gently with her wrinkled, trembling hands, then placed it on the desk in front of him. "She left this with me when she first started working here," she said. "She told me if anything ever happened, if she wasn't here anymore, to mail this to the address on the front. I didn't understand why then, but now I think I do." Arthur looked down. On the envelope, besides the neat handwriting with an address in a quiet suburb, was a name. Dr. Evelyn Reed, Department of Linguistics, Columbia University. "I don't know what's inside," Maria continued, her voice growing keener. "But I think maybe the person who should read it isn't an old friend. Maybe it's the person who played a part in making this story happen." Arthur picked up the envelope. It was so light it felt empty, but he felt the weight of a whole life inside it. Maria looked at him, her gaze no longer sad, but gentle, like a mother seeing her child off on a journey. Sometimes, Sire, God doesn't send us punishment, but a chance to understand ourselves again. Perhaps she is that chance. Arthur nodded. He stood up and bowed his head slightly in thanks. As he walked out of the restaurant, the Manhattan sun beat down. Harsh and bright, the streets were as busy as ever. But for him, everything seemed different. The guilt in his heart now had a shape, a direction. The envelope in his hand was like a compass. It pointed the way forward, not for redemption, but to find the part of himself he had lost. He stopped at a crosswalk, watching the hurried crowd. Then he quietly tightened his grip on the envelope, whispering, as if making a promise to himself, "I will find you, Elena Morales, and this time, I will listen." The envelope in Arthur's coat pocket carried an invisible weight. Maria's words still echoed in his head, not as an accusation, but as a solemn trust. "I'm giving you this not because I trust you. I'm giving it to you because I have no other choice." The thought weighed heavily on his heart. Perhaps, of all the people involved in this story, he was the only one who still had a chance to do the right thing. Instead of returning to his office where logic and numbers reigned, he drove to a small park on the edge of the city. It was midday, and sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the hood of his car. He turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin, listening to the wind rustling through the trees. He carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a small, cold metal key. With it, a piece of paper folded into a square. The handwriting was neat and clear. Locker #37, Social Sciences Library. For Evelyn. Evelyn's name was underlined twice. Arthur stared at the words for a long time, then called James. "James, find me information on a Dr. Evelyn Reed, formerly of the linguistics department at Columbia." "Yes." "One moment." "Sire." The sound of typing came through the phone. "Here she is." She was Elena Morales' doctoral advisor, co-chair of the project that was sued 3 years ago. And now? She took an early retirement right after the incident. No one knows where she went. A professor abandoning her career right after her student was ruined. That one detail was enough for Arthur to know there was something deeper hidden behind the story. He started the car. The Social Sciences Library was so quiet you could hear the echo of footsteps on the floor. Tall, dusty shelves stood in rows, the smell of old paper hanging in the air, like the scent of time itself. Arthur, in his expensive suit and with a tense expression, looked out of place among the young students hunched over their books. He went down to the basement. A row of metal lockers stood in a neat, silent line, like a troop of guards. Locker #37. The key slid smoothly into the lock, making a dry click. Inside, there was only a dusty cardboard document box. Arthur placed the box on a table and opened the lid. A puff of dust rose, carrying the old smell of forgotten years. Inside were notebooks, loose notes, and several printed-out email chains. He flipped through a notebook. Small, even script filled the pages with complex formulas, diagrams, and ideas. Even without understanding it all, he could feel the passion in every stroke of the pen, something money could never buy. Tucked between the pages were old emails, correspondence between Elena and Victor Vance. She had sent him everything, trusting that she was collaborating with a like-minded colleague. A young academic's innocence had been exploited, and he had used it to trade for power. At the bottom of the box was a USB drive and a sealed envelope. Arthur picked it up. There was no recipient's name, only a simple line. "If you are reading this, it means I have failed." He opened the letter. The handwriting was slightly slanted and shaky, but clear. "Elena, I am so sorry. I trusted the wrong person. They told me to destroy everything. But I couldn't. I kept this not for revenge, but so that when you are strong enough, you will know that you were right all along. I am so proud of you. Evelyn." Just a few short lines. No excuses. No philosophy. A real, rough, and deeply human apology. Arthur sat in silence. In the quiet room, he heard Maria's voice again. I have no other choice. Now, he had no other choice either. He plugged in the USB drive. Files appear audio. Images. Emails. Victor Vance's voice filled his headphones low, condescending, discussing how to repurpose Elena's data without leaving a trace. Other files were internal memos, where lawyers from Innovatech proposed tactics to stonewall Elena's team. He didn't need to understand the technical language. Just listening was enough to know this was a true conspiracy. And worse, his own company had provided legal services to them. Arthur closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. A cold feeling spread down his spine. Maria had been right. Elena never could have won alone. She was just one person, and they were an entire system. The afternoon light streamed through the window, casting a grey-gold hue on the document box. Arthur stared at it for a long time. Inside was not just stolen work, but a buried reputation. And now, he, the man who had unwittingly played a part in that injustice, was the one holding the chance to fix it. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. It was no longer curiosity or a sense of debt. It was conviction. The conviction that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, deserves to be brought to light. Arthur stood up, carefully placing everything back in the box. He held it tightly and walked out of the library. On the stone steps, the wind blew, carrying the distant chime of a clock tower. The box was no longer just evidence. It was an opportunity, not just to reclaim justice for Elena Morales, but for him to find himself again, the man who once believed power could replace what was right. And this time, Arthur Pierce swore he would not let what was right be bought with silence. Arthur didn't return to the office. The glass walls, the luxurious furniture, it all felt suffocating now. Everything in that room had once been a symbol of success, but now it was a mirror, reflecting his own blindness. Instead, he drove to a discreet corporate apartment he kept, in a quiet part of the city, a place he jokingly called his war room. And today, it would live up to its name. The moment he walked in, he placed the document box on the glass coffee table. It sat there, simple and silent, yet heavier than any asset he had ever owned. Inside was the past, and possibly redemption. Arthur picked up his phone. His voice was low and decisive. James, clear my schedule for the next 48 hours. No exceptions. A brief pause on the other end. Yes. Sir. Anything else? 2 things. First, find me the current address of Elena Morales. No one is to know. Second, I want a detailed financial report on Innovatech Solutions, specifically their debt, investors, any exploitable weaknesses. Before we begin, there's something I have to do. What's that? Ricardo asked, his tone skeptical. I need to see her. Ricardo frowned. He advised against it. We're on the right track. She'll only be a distraction. Arthur turned, his gaze as deep and hard as stone. I will not use her name, her story, as a weapon. Without her permission. I did that once already, and it destroyed a person. Ricardo fell silent. Something in Arthur's voice stopped him from arguing further. Arthur walked to the table and looked down at the document box. He had once treated everything as a deal, but this time, he understood this wasn't a power play. This was about atonement. He grabbed his coat, ready to leave. Ricardo asked quietly, Are you sure about this? Arthur paused at the door. No, he replied, but I know it's what I have to do. The door closed behind him. In the apartment, the light reflected off the glass table where the USB drive still lay, small and dangerous as a blade. And Arthur Pierce, for the first time in years, wasn't acting for profit, but for something he thought had long since died inside him, the belief that truth was worth more than power. The 400-mile drive up the New England coast felt like a penitent pilgrimage. When Arthur found the small apartment overlooking the ocean, he stood on the street below for a long time, a sense of dread washing over him. He wasn't just facing a mystery, he was facing the direct consequences of his own actions. He took a deep breath and knocked. A few seconds later, the door opened. Elena stood there. The moment she recognized him, the composure on her face shattered. It was replaced by shock, which instantly hardened into cold vigilance. Her eyes narrowed. Her shoulders tensed. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharp as a knife. She didn't invite him in. Her body formed a barrier in the doorway. "Miss Morales, Elena," he began, his voice faltering. "I came here to apologize." "Apologize?" She let out a short, mirthless laugh. "You drove 400 miles to apologize for a bad dinner party? I don't buy it. It's not just about that," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I apologize for my arrogance, for humiliating you. My actions were inexcusable, and I want you to know that I spoke to the restaurant owner." "You spoke to him?" she cut in, her voice defiant. "To tell him you'd compensate him for taking me back? Do you still think everything can be solved with your money?" "No." "Go home. Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice now weary. "I don't want to hear it. It's over." She started to close the door. In a moment of panic, Arthur put his hand out to stop it. "Victor Vance," he said, letting the name drop like a final weapon. Elena's hand froze. The weariness in her eyes vanished, replaced by a raw tension. "What did you say?" "I know about him. I know about the project." "The lawsuit," Arthur said quickly, feeling he'd found an opening. "I know you're innocent." Silence descended. The sound of the waves outside seemed to hold its breath. Elena stared at him, trying to read him, searching for any sign of deceit. Finally, with a resigned sigh, she stepped back, letting him enter. Inside, the air was still thick with tension. She didn't offer him a seat. "How do you know?" she asked. Arthur decided on the truth. He told her about investigating the files, about his own company's role, and about the box Dr. Reed had left behind. As he spoke, he could see her defensive walls slowly lowering, replaced by a profound, sorrowful pain. "Evelyn," she whispered the name like a prayer. "She left proof," Arthur said, placing the document box on the table. "Everything we need to go after Victor." He opened his laptop, intending to show her the USB drive. But as he rummaged in the box, a file he'd reviewed the night before slipped out and fell to the floor. Opening to the last page, the page with two signatures, Victor Vance's, and right beside it, his own crisp, unmistakable e-signature, Arthur Pierce. It was one of the initial approval documents his legal department had processed. Elena bent down and picked it up. Her eyes scanned the page, then stopped on his signature. She looked up, and the look in her eyes made Arthur feel a deep chill. The doubt, the pain, and the flicker of understanding were gone. All that remained was betrayal and a towering rage. "It was you," she said, her voice trembling. "From the very beginning. Your name is right here. Elena." "Let me explain," he said hurriedly. "It was a mistake. I didn't know what I was signing. The legal department—" "I didn't know," she repeated, her voice now dripping with contempt. "That's the excuse of the powerful. You sign things that ruin people's lives. And then you say, 'I didn't know.' You didn't come here to help me. You came here to clean up your own mess." She threw the file down on the table. "Do you think I'm a fool? You and him are the same. You're both part of the same world that destroyed me." "That's not true," he tried to argue, but his words were meaningless against the force of her fury. "Get out," she screamed. The first time he had seen her lose her composure. Tears began to well in her defiant eyes. "Get out of my house. Now." She pointed to the door, her whole body shaking. Arthur stood there, utterly helpless. He had come to build a bridge, only to dig the chasm deeper. He had brought the truth, only to expose his own complicity in the cruelest way possible. He backed away, his confidence shattered. He walked out the door, not daring to look back. It slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot, ending all hope. He walked down the stairs, the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. When he reached his car, he got in and rested his forehead against the steering wheel. He had made everything worse. He put the key in the ignition and turned it. Click. Nothing. The dashboard was dark. He tried again. Click. Click. The battery was dead. His luxury car, the symbol of his power, was now a useless hunk of metal. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. The irony was staggering. Even the universe was mocking his impotence. He was stranded in a strange town, with a broken-down car. No, c'è il service. And the only door he could possibly knock on was the one that had just been slammed in his face. Elena's rage lasted only a few minutes. It flared up like a brush fire, consuming everything in its path, then died out, leaving behind an empty, bone-deep exhaustion. She sank to the floor, her back against the door she had just slammed, and let the tears she had held back for 3 years finally fall. She wasn't crying for Arthur, but for the stark truth he had delivered. His signature on that paper was a cruel confirmation that she hadn't been undone by a single traitor, but by an entire, unfeeling system that had crushed her. She sat there for how long? She didn't know. It was only when a knock came again, soft and hesitant, that she flinched. "What is it now?" she yelled through the door, her voice hoarse. "Miss Morales, Elena." Arthur's voice came from the other side, sounding embarrassed. "It's me. I have a problem." Elena got to her feet, wiping away her tears. She refused to let him see her weak. She opened the door a crack, just enough to see out. "What kind of problem?" "My car," he said, gesturing toward the dark street. "It won't start. I think the battery's dead." He held up his phone. "And there's no service here." Elena stared at him. The powerful CEO, a man who could move markets with a single call, was now standing on her doorstep, as helpless as a lost child. A part of her wanted to laugh. Another part wanted to slam the door again. "Well, that's your problem," she said coolly. "I know," he replied, his voice resigned. "I was just wondering if there's a tow service around here, or a motel." Elena sighed. Her anger was giving way to the harsh reality of small-town life. The only garage closed hours ago, and there are no motels here. "Mr. Pierce, you're at the end of the world." Silence fell between them, punctuated by the steady rhythm of the waves. He looked ridiculous in his expensive suit, completely out of place. She could let him sleep in his car. He deserved it. But then she thought of her mother, who had taught her that kindness wasn't something you rationed out based on merit. "Damn it," she muttered under her breath, then pulled the door open. "Come in." Arthur stepped inside, looking both grateful and intensely awkward. Don't say anything." She cut him off. "The couch. One night. In the morning, I'll have Mr. Henderson take a look at your car. For now, I need my space." She went into her bedroom and closed the door, leaving him alone in the living room. Arthur stood in the middle of the small room, feeling like an intruder. He took off his suit jacket and loosened his tie, familiar actions that felt alien in this space. He sat down on the couch and listened to the ocean. An hour later, the bedroom door opened. Elena emerged, holding a glass. She didn't look at him. She walked straight to the kitchen, took some pills from a cabinet, and washed them down with water. When she turned, he could see her eyes were swollen. He felt an urge to say something. Anything. "The lawsuit," he began, his voice raspy. "I read the file. Why did you settle? Why didn't you fight?" Elena paused, her back to him. "Fight with what? Mr. Pierce?" she asked, her voice devoid of anger now, filled only with an endless fatigue, with a researcher's meager savings, with the strength of an old father who had to sell his land to pay his daughter's legal fees. She turned to face him, her eyes boring into his. "They're lawyers. The ones your company paid for. They didn't have to win. They just had to stall. Every postponed hearing, every new discovery request, was another bill we couldn't pay. They didn't attack my case. They attacked my life, until there was nothing left to attack." Arthur was speechless. Her words painted a picture far crueler than anything he had read in the files. "And Evelyn," Elena continued, her voice breaking. "They threatened her, said they'd ruin her reputation, claimed she was an accomplice. She had to retire to protect her other students. Do you understand? He took everything from me, including my only mentor." She sank into the armchair opposite him, burying her face in her hands. The silence in the room was suffocating. Arthur felt himself shrink. His world of multi-million-dollar contracts and power negotiations suddenly seemed meaningless. This was the real, raw consequence of it all. He got up and went to the kitchen. He didn't know what he was looking for. He just moved on instinct. He found a box of chamomile tea and heated some water. A few minutes later, he returned to the living room with 2 mugs. He placed one on the table in front of her. She looked up, surprised. He sat down, keeping his distance. "I can't change what happened, Elena," he said, his voice for the first time lacking its usual confidence, holding only a tired sincerity. "But I swear to you, I will make him pay for it. Not to clean up my mess, but because it's the right thing to do." Elena didn't answer. She just picked up the mug, its warmth seeming to seep into her cold hands. The storm had passed, leaving behind a wounded stillness. The night was long, and for the first time, they weren't adversaries, but just 2 lonely people, listening together to the waves outside. He spent the night on the couch, listening to the ocean and thinking about the life he had led, about the signatures he'd scribbled without a thought, about the indifference he had disguised as being busy. When the first rays of dawn crept into the room, Elena emerged from the bedroom. She looked as if she hadn't slept either. Her eyes were still puffy, but there was a new calm in her gaze. The anger of the previous night had been replaced by something else, a deep thoughtfulness. They said nothing. Elena made coffee, and they drank it in silence, watching the ocean awaken. The silence was no longer awkward. It was a truce, a space for them both to think. At 7 o'clock sharp, there was a knock on the door. It was Mr. Henderson, the mechanic, an older man with calloused hands and a kind smile. Elena must have called him early. Arthur followed him down to the car. The problem was just as he'd suspected, a dead battery. "Must have left your lights on, Mr. Henderson said cheerfully as he worked. "These new cars are a nuisance." It took only 15 minutes, a set of jumper cables, and a few friendly grumbles before the luxury car's engine roared reluctantly back to life. Arthur paid Mr. Henderson an amount that could probably keep the old man comfortable for a month. After the mechanic left, he didn't get into the car right away. He stood there, looking up at the balcony of Elena's apartment. She was standing there, watching him, her arms crossed. He knew this was the decisive moment. He could get in the car and drive away, leave it all behind, and return to his safe world. Ricardo's plan could still be executed in silence, but he knew it would be an act of cowardice. He looked directly up at her, his voice loud enough to carry in the crisp morning air. "I'm leaving, Elena." She didn't respond, just stood there, listening. "Last night," he continued, You said you just wanted to be left alone. I understand that. After everything that's happened, you have every right to that peace. You could stay here, in this quiet place, and no one would blame you." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I've also seen who you are. A brilliant mind, an unbreakable dignity. A person like you," his voice grew stronger, "doesn't deserve a life in hiding. A person like you deserves to have her name cleared, to be vindicated, to be restored to her rightful place." He opened the car door but didn't get in. He turned to look at her one last time. "My plan is still in place. The evidence is still there. We can make him pay. I can't do it alone. Elena, I need you. I need your knowledge, your truth. I'll be waiting in the car." He looked straight into her eyes, and his final words were not a demand. "Buta sincere plea. Come out when you're ready. Come out when you feel strong enough to demand justice, not just for yourself, but to give me a chance to redeem my own mistake." With that, he got into the car and closed the door. But he didn't start the engine. He just sat there, waiting. Elena stood on the balcony, motionless. Arthur's words echoed in her mind. "A person like you deserves to have her name cleared." For 3 years, no one had said that to her. People had looked at her with pity, suspicion, or they had simply forgotten her. And now he, the man who had played a part in her downfall, was the first to see her true worth. She looked out at the sea. The vast ocean had given her peace, a place to heal, but it was also a hiding place. She could keep hiding, keep living a small, safe life. Or she could go back, not with the naivete of before, but with the wisdom of a survivor. She looked down at the car below. He was still there, waiting. An opportunity, a risque. She took a deep breath, the salty air filling her lungs. It was the smell of freedom, but freedom inside an invisible cage. And then, she made her decision. She turned back inside, grabbed her only coat and her purse, and locked the apartment door. Arthur sat in the car, his heart pounding. Every second felt like an hour. He had almost given up hope. And then, he heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. He looked up. Elena was walking toward the car. Her expression held no smile, no fear, only a cool determination, an acceptance that the truce was over. She walked to the passenger side, opened the door, and got in without a word. She placed her bag at her feet. "All right, Mr. Pierce," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Tell me your plan." Arthur looked at her, a wave of relief and profound respect washing over him. He nodded and started the engine. The car slowly pulled away, leaving the quiet town behind, heading back to Manhattan, where the real battle awaited. The journey back to New York was a strategy session. Elena didn't just agree with Ricardo's plan. She improved it. "The financial attack is right," she said, "but we need a blow to his pride. Victor is obsessed with his academic reputation. That's his real weakness." The plan was executed with lethal precision. An anonymous research paper surfaced. Rumors spread. Investors started calling Victor Vance, a man built on arrogance, began to feel the heat. He had no idea where the attack was coming from. Then, Elena delivered the decisive blow. She wrote a brilliant analysis, pointing out the flaws and suspicious similarities in Innovatech's core technology compared to an older project, and sent it anonymously to the board of a prestigious European tech prize for which Victor was a leading candidate. His academic credibility was now under threat. Predictably, Victor panicked and called Arthur for help. "Arthur, something strange is happening. I think we should accelerate the merger. An announcement of a partnership with Pierce Holdings would kill all these rumors." "I agree," Arthur replied over the phone, putting it on speaker for Elena to hear. "But before we sign, there's a small matter we need to resolve. Concerning someone named Elena Morales." The silence on the other end of the line said everything. The confrontation took place in Arthur's office. Victor walked in, trying to maintain his confident facade. "All right, Arthur. What's this game?" Arthur didn't answer. He just pressed a button. The door to the adjacent conference room opened. Elena walked in. Victor's face went white. "You two? There is no us," Elena said, her voice like ice. "There is only the truth." "Victor." Arthur placed the USB drive on the table. "Option A. Everything on this drive goes to the district attorney's office tomorrow morning. You will lose everything." He paused. "Or option B. You hold a press conference. You publicly apologize to Dr. Elena Morales. You restore full credit for her work. And you pay damages." Victor looked at Elena, his eyes full of hate. "You'll never beat me." Elena smiled. A real smile. "I already won." "Victor," she said softly, "the moment I decided I was no longer afraid." Victor's confidence crumbled. He looked at the USB drive, then at his lawyer, who gave a slight shake of his head. The game was over. "Fine," Victor said, his voice dead. Option B. Epilogue. The press conference was a pathetic spectacle, but Elena and Arthur didn't watch it together. Elena chose to be alone in the corporate apartment, saying she needed to face it by herself. Arthur respected that. He sat in his own office, watching the live feed, feeling a strange mix of relief that justice was served and anxiety for how Elena was feeling. When it was over, he drove to her. He found her standing on the balcony, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. She wasn't crying or smiling. There was just a profound stillness about her. "It's done," he said softly, standing beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "Yes," she replied, her gaze still on the horizon. "It feels like closing an old book. It didn't have a happy ending, but at least I was able to read the final page." They stood together in silence for a long time. The silence was no longer a weapon or a barrier. It had become a safe space, where they could exist without words. A few days later, after a press conference of his own, Arthur invited Elena to dinner, not at a fancy restaurant, but at a small, cozy Italian place in her old neighborhood, where the owner knew everyone by name. It was the first night they truly talked, not about Victor or plans, but about themselves. Elena spoke of her childhood in a small town, her love for language, her dream of building bridges between cultures. Arthur, for the first time in years, opened up. He talked about the pressure of inheriting an empire, the loneliness at the top, and how he had slowly lost sight of himself in the race for power. That night at the restaurant, he confessed, "When you spoke 10 languages, I didn't just feel humiliated. I felt envious. You had something I'd lost long ago, a pure passion." Elena looked at him, and this time, there was no defense in her eyes, only understanding. "Maybe," she said quietly. "We were both trying to find something we'd lost." After dinner, they walked through Central Park. Under the golden glow of the lamps, their shadows stretched long on the path. There was no dramatic moment, no grand declaration, just a quiet, natural shift. When they stopped by the lake, Arthur turned to her. "Elena," he said, his voice holding a sincerity she had never heard before, "I know I can't change the past, but I don't want my future to be without you in it." He wasn't talking about love. He was talking about presence, about connection. Elena didn't answer right away. She looked at their reflections on the still water. For 3 years, she had lived in fear and loneliness. And he, the man who had entered her life like a storm, had become the only one who saw the real her. And more importantly, had helped her find herself again. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I feel the same way, Arthur." He gently reached up, his fingers brushing a stray curl from her face. A simple gesture, but it held everything they had been through. In that moment, they were no longer a powerful CEO and a former waitress. They were just two people who had found each other in the wreckage. 1 year later, autumn in New York. The air was crisp, the sunlight as soft and golden as honey. On a quiet street, nestled between a bakery and an old bookstore, stood a small building with an elegant, hand-carved wooden sign, the Bridge Language Institute. This wasn't just Elena's school, it was theirs. Arthur had used his business acumen to help her build it from the ground up. He wasn't a silent benefactor. He was her co-founder, her partner. A man who had found a new purpose, alongside running his empire. Inside, the space was alive with laughter and the cheerful babble of different languages. Elena was in the courtyard, bending down to correct the Spanish pronunciation of a little Syrian girl with wide, curious eyes. Elena smiled, a radiant smile. Free from the weight of the past, she had found peace not by hiding, but by building something new and meaningful. Arthur stood in the doorway of his small office there, watching her quietly. He had found his own peace not by abandoning his world, but by building a new one with her. He looked at her, not with the eyes of a powerful man, but of someone who had learned to cherish simple things. When the classes ended and the children poured out the gate, waving goodbye, Elena walked toward him. She reached up and smoothed a wrinkle on his shirt collar. A familiar, affectionate gesture. "Working late again?" she asked, her tone gently scolding, but her eyes full of love. "Just making sure our bridge is secure," he replied, taking her hand, their fingers intertwined naturally. A perfect fit. They walked together in the empty courtyard as the sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dry leaves and tranquility. "Did you ever think it would end up like this?" Arthur asked, his voice warm. "Never," Elena admitted, leaning her head on his shoulder as they walked. "I thought I'd spend the rest of my life by the ocean, alone." "And I," he said, "thought I'd spend the rest of mine in boardrooms, also alone." They stopped in the middle of the courtyard. Arthur turned to face her. The sunset bathed her face in a golden light, making her eyes sparkle like early stars. "That night at the restaurant," he said, his voice no longer holding regret, only gratitude. "I asked you to serve me in 10 languages, but I've spent the last year just trying to learn one." "What language is that?" she asked, smiling, a smile that lit up the space around them. "The language of silence," he answered softly. "The one we have right now?" He said no more. Instead, he slowly raised his hand, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her cheek. It wasn't a gesture of possession or passion, but a quiet question, a deep appreciation. Elena didn't pull away. She tilted her head, pressing her cheek into his warm palm, and closed her eyes. A simple gesture, but it contained all the trust and peace she had found. It was her answer, one that needed no words. They stood there for a long moment, no kiss or further words necessary. There was only a complete understanding, wrapped in the twilight and the soft flamenco guitar that began to drift from a nearby classroom. In that silence, 2 worlds, 2 lives, and 2 hearts had become one. The autumn wind blew gently, making the the bridge sign sway. Like a whisper, the bridge between them had been built, not with grand words, but with acts of respect, attention, and finally, love. And that was the most beautiful language of all. Some people are wrong not in their actions, but in how they see others. Arthur Pierce once thought power defined a person, until he saw a woman wiping glasses with hands that had once written a doctoral thesis and realized that some values can never be written into a contract. Elena Morales had no money, no power, but she held on to what many people lose in the struggle to survive: dignity and truth. She lost her career, but she won in character, and with her quiet composure, she made a man who thought he had no heart to begin to think again. Sometimes life doesn't demand that anyone kneel, only that one person looks at another with honest eyes, long enough to see that they themselves have been too high, too cold, and too alone. If you've ever been misunderstood, ever been judged, because you weren't wealthy or prominent, remember that what defines your worth isn't what they say, but how you rise after every fall. True respect cannot be bought or begged for. It can only be earned by those who dare to live truthfully. And what about you? In this noisy, judgmental world, do you still believe in kindness? In the value of truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Who knows? Your small story today could become someone else's inspiration tomorrow.